Hey guys, week 11. Sorry, I was fixing my hair. All right, week 11. Here we go. How's everyone? Everyone doing okay? Sorry, I'm a little scattered. Had the one of the worst flu bugs I've ever had in my life earlier this week. I'm just now coming back into the land of the living. So, thanks for your patience, and yeah, I'm just glad I'm healthy enough to do this today. So anyway, housekeeping stuff. Subjects for your interview paper. Thank you for bringing those in or sending those in. Some of you asked, here's a name. What else are you looking for? Basically, a name. Basically, that you've thought enough to think of the individual, and hopefully, it's not just a name that you've just thought of, but you've asked that individual, scheduled some time, or at least discussed the possibility of having some time. Again, Appendix B, a lot of good, helpful information there. But obviously, if you haven't had that conversation with that person, it's time to have it. In terms of scheduling something like, hey, this is what I'm looking for. And again, a lot of you, like, just to give you an example of just what, things that I want you to think about. A lot of you have chosen peers, friends of yours that are in college or close to you in terms of age. That's fine, I don't mind. Think about, for somebody like that, for example, you might want to think about, okay, they don't have a whole lot of, if you're young, if you're an old fart, that's different. But if you're young, and yes, as an old fart, I can say that. But if you're young and you don't have a lot of life experience yet, and the person you're interviewing doesn't have a lot of life experience yet either, then how do you counter that? Well, one of the things you can do is you can say, how does your faith influence the way you see the future? So for this person, how does their Christianity influence the decisions they make now in terms of major, in terms of life partner, in terms of the life they see themselves having? So, if you're interviewing someone who's 21, there's not going to be a lot to... Most cases, there's not going to be a lot to that story. Some of them, they've braved persecution or they've been ostracized by their family. That's different. But if you're looking, going, okay, where do I find material here? If this person's very young, then one of the ways in which you can find material is to think about the future. Does that make sense? So anyway, get those names, engage with those people, buy those people coffee, buy them lunch. Schedule enough time for this, because I don't want that. If your conversation's 10 minutes, you don't have enough material. So make sure you schedule enough time to get a real meaty conversation about how this person's Christianity affects the way they live their daily life. And hey, it's election season. You can, if you're close enough, you can ask about how does your Christianity affect the way you vote. If you want to go that direction, you can. Prepare to duck if they don't want that question. Just kidding. So what I really want, just to stress it one more time, what I really want is not just this person believes this. Okay. If this person believes this and it influences their life in X, Y, Z, tangible, concrete ways. Do you see the difference? That's what I'm looking for. That's what I want. So yeah. So you have that, and then it's a normal week. There's a discussion question. There's quiz questions for you. So that's all basic and normal. In terms of this lecture time, I want to finish the stuff I didn't get to last week in the history, and then I want to get into silence. And this week for the reading, I want you to read roughly the first half. I want you to read the translator's preface, because it's very important. There's a lot there. I want you to read the prologue and then the first 5 chapters. So in my version, which it's not here, it probably should be, in my version, that is the first 90, it's through page 99, so it's roughly halfway there. Depending on what version you get, it's going to be different. Sorry, I'm looking around to make sure that I don't have my book here. That's foolish. I really should have it. I might actually get up and get it. We'll see. So you have through page 99. You know what? I want it in front of me, so sorry about this. I'll be right back. Didn't have to go too far, and you had a little time to see the mess behind me in my study. So there we go. So through page 99, this is my copy. I don't know if your version looks like mine or not, but chapters 1 through 5, the prologue and also the translator's preface as well. But before we do that, let me wrap up some things from the history. We talked a lot about, we basically got through the Reformation. Through the Reformation and just kind of the after effects of the Reformation, the fact that there was quite a lot of violence in the aftermath. There were different responses to the Reformation, and different variants. We talked about the Lutherans, we talked about the Reformed, we talked about Anabaptists, we talked about the Council of Trent, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation, or there's a lot of different titles for it. But what you have at its core, what you have is a church that begins to split, that begins to divide, that begins to have factions and denominations, and a lot of times these denominations don't like each other. Protestants and Catholics end up killing each other quite a bit in the 16th and 17th centuries, and both of them kill Anabaptists. No one likes the Anabaptists for some strange reason. But there's a lot of religious violence, a lot of I don't like what you believe, therefore you gotta die. And there's a line from McGrath here that I think is really good. He says, "The scene was set for the Enlightenment's insistence that religion was to be a matter of private belief rather than one of state policy." And you can understand why this is the case, right? I mean, if people are killing each other, going to war, and lots of people are dying because of religious belief, after a while you just kind of look around and say, this is stupid. Let's dial down the violence. How do you do that? What you do is you encourage a shift, a shift away from a more public, a more theocracy, although that's maybe not the best word, a more theocratic public religion, like we all do this, and you run it to more of an individualist and to more of a, my personal faith journey type of thing, where Christianity becomes, and this is right in the spirit of the time. I mean, the modern age is a very individualistic age, and this is right along with the spirit of that. But what comes is you have religion goes from this big different states or different religions, and if you're not that, then you can't live in this state or we'll kill you, you must leave this state, to more of an individualistic thing, like I, in my private faith, am Catholic. That person over there is Lutheran. That person over there is Anabaptist, and hey, as long as they don't, bring it up at parties, we're cool. So it becomes more privatized, more individualized, and that trend continues. But while that's going on, I mean, it's complex. There's multiple streams. All history, there's multiple streams happening. So while that's happening, the seeds of democracy are also beginning to be sown, and there's a really interesting parallel between this individualization of religion, not becoming a state religion, a moral religion of your personal beliefs and preferences. There's a really interesting parallel between that movement on the one hand and the movement towards democracy on the other. Because democracy is this kind of the voice of the individual. It's the way in which the individual says, my voice, let me stand up and give my voice. We're right in the middle of election season, so that's, you're going to hear a lot of that. You've already heard a lot of that. It's interesting. You hear cynicism about that. When someone like Donald Trump said, and I promise this won't go political, but when Donald Trump gets up and says the election is rigged, that's a pretty profound statement of cynicism about our national project. But this democratic project really starts to take off right around the same time. There's kind of a collective looking around at each other going, okay, this nation's going to war and killing each other over publicly expressed religious beliefs. We don't like this anymore. We're tired of this. We want to dial this down. And that provides the opening for this more individualistic democracy to kind of slide in and go, oh, okay, maybe this is a new way of being, a new political technique that we can use. And the classic example, of course, is the American Project, because the American Project is a democratic project. It's also a project that is heavily involved in, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but telling the Church of England to go screw. I mean, it is very much a look at. We're going to do what we want, and we're going to experience our faith this way. And if you don't like it, we really don't care. I think it's an underrated part of the American Revolution. The fact that it is so wrapped up in, like, for example, the preaching of Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening and the religious revivals that were sweeping the country played a major role. It doesn't get the headlines as much. But anyway, in terms of Christianity, in terms of the nature of this religious faith, there's a push inward. And that there's a push inward, which not just in a way that engages the rational faculties, but inward in a way that engages the heart. So the move is not only privatized, like, hey, just me. The move goes here. The move goes into the heart, into the emotional center, because Christianity becomes a lot more emotional. There's a movement called pietism. What's pietism? Pietism is this kind of a sense of Christianity as something that is felt. Aquinas, you don't get a lot of that in Aquinas and scholasticism. You have Christianity that is thought, that is experienced. Not even experienced, not the right word, but that is thought, that is processed, cognitively processed. Pietism isn't a response to scholasticism. It's more of Christianity that is felt more than thought. More emotional, more given to this. John Wesley wasn't a pietist. He was influenced by them. His conversion is very famous because his conversion catches a lot of this. The famous phrase from Wesley's conversion, he says, "I felt my heart strangely warmed." There's no cognitive thought there, but the truth of Christianity for him is revealed not in an aha moment, not in a light bulb going off above his head. It's revealed to him in the fact that he's feeling his heart go. His heart grew 3 sizes. That almost like How the Grinch Stole Christmas. He's feeling his heart warm. He's feeling his heart glow, and that is the indicator that This is how I need to live my life. This is what my existence is. It's a famous story, and I've given you a link to it. You should read it. It's a page. It's short. But you should read his conversion letter because it's really interesting, because it is very much this kind of heart strangely warm type of thing. It's personal piety. It's the role of emotion. It's the role of experience. And again, this is very different than Aquinas. It's even different than someone like Calvin. Calvin, is also this systematic theologian. So for Calvin, Christianity is thought. It's processed. It's cognitive first. Now Calvin's smart enough to not leave it there. But the dominant force, the dominant way in which human beings engage this religion is through the mind. Wesley and the Pietists and this movement that comes after changes that and says, no, the dominant way in which we as human beings engage this religion is through our hearts. I hope you can see what a massive difference that is, because it's a totally different way of looking. Now, where are we at today? It depends on who you ask. It depends on who you talk to. Because we are emotional beings, but we are rational beings, and those instincts are kind of at war sometimes, and different people process different ways. But you can have really, the kind of scholastic, the kind of I read systematic theology and faith is worked out through my mind. C.S. Lewis said something like that. He said, I feel God when I work through difficult theology. Whereas you have other folks that say, I feel God in a worship service, or I feel God in an emotional moment. It's different ways. Do you engage this religion through here, or do you engage it through here? The Scholastics and Calvin, the Pietists and the modern day Methodists. Well, not the forerunners of the modern day Methodists, the Wesleys. There's more of this. So huge difference. But you have, one of the after effects of this shift, one of the after effects of the pietistic movement, this focus on personal piety, personal devotion, personal emotion, are these massive revivals. And you have these revivals, they're called the Great Awakening. There's more than one. But the Great Awakening happens, the first one. And here's how it comes about. The first, and this is largely from McGrath, so if you want more details and more filled in Go back and reread Jim McGrath. Um, McGrath says, while the first immigrants in America were deeply devout, the first, the Puritans, right? I mean, in the colonies they set up, Massachusetts Bay Colony. The first immigrants to America were deeply devout, but their religious devotion cools over time. And McGrath goes on to say that for a long stretch of time, the colonial America was largely nominalist. What's a nominalist? Christian in name only, basically, when it comes to their Christianity. How does that get reversed? How does that get changed? These preachers, John Wesley, George Whitefield, and especially Jonathan Edwards. And they, Edwards in particular, lead what is known as the Great Awakening, and this happens in 1734. So we're still talking about colonial America, right? We're pre-revolution at this point. But there is a national, if you can even use the word national, but there's a national revival. You have these preachers that travel, and they speak to huge crowds, and they're not given intellectualistic lectures. They're given calls to, appeals to the emotion. Watch how this changes your heart. Watch how this changes your life. And there's emotional resonance with that. And they whip up a lot of crowds, and this massive revival happens, and it's called the Great Awakening. And the first one happens in 1734. And listen to McGrath again. He says, "It is no exaggeration to say that the roots of the American Revolution lay in the growing religious alienation between the new popular American religion and the established religion of England. Within a generation of the Great Awakening, the colonies were in revolt against the colonial power." So, catch this. For a long time, you have this kind of, like back in England, High Church England, you have this kind of staid, intellectual, largely unemotional religion. Like, we go to church because that is what we do, and we do this because we are English, we are Christian, we're Anglican, this is what we do. And for a while, the American colonies is basically saying, after the initial fervor cools, the American colonies follow in those footsteps. But with the Great Awakening, with these preachers, it becomes, how does it can't be just part of our civil structures of society. It's got to be something that's meaningful to us as individuals, otherwise scrap it, there's no need for it. So you have this very personalized, very individualized, very emotionalized version of Christianity taking hold. And according to McGrath, and I think he's right, this distance, this break, we're going away from that very English, very civilized, very dignified, intellectualized faith. This break is a catalyst for revolution. So you have that, and this is the American religious heritage. So when it comes to religion, American Christianity, this is our heritage. Our heritage is this pietistic, individualized, emotionalized, I feel God, therefore God is there, type of thing. There are exceptions, of course. I mean, there are American Christians who dig theology and get deep into systematic theology and engage it through their heads. But our national heritage is more of this pietism. Is more of your Christianity depends on your personal piety. It depends on how it makes you feel. And some commentators have said, this is a problem. Christian Smith teaches at Notre Dame. He's a sociologist. He says this has led to what he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. I expect God to make me feel better about my life. That's an extreme version. That's, some would say that's a heretical version. But it's important to note, and for your purposes, it's important to say that this is our inheritance as American. If you're an American Christian, this is your inheritance. A faith that is driven not so much by national affiliation, not even so much by denominational affiliation, but a faith that is driven by your individualized response, your individualized emotional response to this religion. That is the foundation of American Christianity. Rightly or wrongly, that's our thing. That's what we do. So you have that, and this is what leads into this whole process is what leads into the massive denominationalists. I think there's something like 48,000 denominations in the world now. I want to just run through a few, and this is just straight out of McGrath, really. I just want to follow up and just, what he said on some things. But some of the major denominations, and you notice this in your church visitation papers, I'm sure, just how these different denominations, how church plays differently in these denominational contexts. That's kind of the point of that assignment. So you have Catholicism, the one that the Reformation splits away from, goes through a lot of change, a lot of turmoil. They feel compelled to try to catch up with the modern age. In the mid-20th century, they have the Vatican II conference, which is their attempt to do that. There's an Italian term called aggiornamento, which is kind of like, we need to update. We need to get this thing into the 20th century. A lot of controversy, a lot of heat, because there's a sizable contingent of Catholics that say our religion is timeless. That's kind of the point. We need to keep it that way. So there's controversy between traditionalists and more modernists, and that controversy will spill over into all denominations. But Catholicism feels it especially starkly. You also have an explosion of Catholicism in the global South in the modern age, and that has continued to this day. If it were only up to white people, Catholicism would be hurting in America right now, because there's been a flight. Whites have fled Catholicism for the last several decades. And that was really exacerbated by the priest abuse scandal of the late 90s. The aughts, 2003, 2004. That really accelerated that process. But Catholicism maintains a strong presence in America. Why? Well, because the counter of all of the whites that are going out through the back door are all the Hispanics and Latinos coming through the front door. The Latino presence in America has sustained the American Catholic Church. That's the bottom line. It creates its own problems and its own controversies, and how do old, historically white parishes deal with an influx of Catholics and Latinos, and how does that work itself out? But that's the new reality. The American Catholic Church I find fascinating nowadays, because you have a lot of these cultural stuff and how this all plays together. So you have Catholicism, you have Eastern Orthodox, which is Dreyer, the Dante book, the author of the Dante book, Rod Dreyer. He's Russian Orthodox, I think. So you have that. You have the Protestants, which are the product of the Reformation. Protestants, Protestant, there you go. The product of the Reformation. And there's sub-movements within those. There's the Pentecostal movement. There's the evangelical movement. So you have these splintering. You have these different groups that are growing. And you have these, and you have denominations. And denominations reached their height in the 90s, I would argue, because since then there's been a real, there's a decline in denominationalism. The lines between denominations are not as sharply drawn as they used to be. It used to be that if you were a Baptist, or if you were a Presbyterian, or if you were a Methodist, that was a very stark, you are a certain type of person who believes certain types of things, and you're going to act in a certain type of way. And there's there's jokes based on this. Kind of these stereotypes based on behavior. But there was really sharp lines. A Southern Baptist person does this. A Lutheran does this. A Episcopalian does this. You don't have that as much anymore. There's a shift. And there's a book, I didn't make you read it because it's massive, but there's a book that would really, if American religion is your bag, and that's really what you're interested in, there's a book called American Grace. It's written by a couple of authors, Robert Putnam and David Campbell, who are famous sociologists. And they take a hard look at the quantitative data, and they give a really interesting picture of where American religion is. And what they say is that, what they're basically saying is there is a shuffling that's going on. And the shuffling is not along denominational lines, it's along devotional lines. So what does that mean? That means you're going to have people that are going to have affinities across denominational lines, based on the level of their devotion, based on how seriously they take their faith. So, for example, this is what causes conservatives and Catholics, conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals. There was a time where they wouldn't even hardly speak. They wouldn't get married. They wouldn't vote for each other. Go Google Kennedy and the Catholic vote if you don't believe me on that one. There was a time where they wouldn't do anything. They were enemies. They did this. But as this shuffling starts to happen, the conservative evangelical finds that they have more in common with the conservative Catholic than they do with the more nominal evangelical in their church. So when it comes to an issue like abortion, when it comes to an issue like human trafficking, when it comes to an issue like bioethics, cloning, things of that nature, the conservative Catholic and the conservative evangelical found out that they have more in common, and so they band together. So the denominational boundaries don't matter as much as the force of your beliefs, what you believe, the angle of your beliefs, if you will. And this is true on the other side of the equation, the fence, where the liberal Protestant goes, I have more in common with a liberal Catholic than I do with a Southern Baptist. So the denominational lines aren't as important as they used to be, but there's still lines, they're just being redrawn, and they're being redrawn in separate categories. And you have groups formed across denominational lines as a result. And all of this is going on, by the way, while consumerism enters the picture. A la carte Christianity. So I can pick and choose, I can church hop, I can do all these different things. But what it produces is a society where the old divisions don't matter as much as they used to. And there's good involved in that, and there's also scary involved in that. The good is there's the level of choice. You can go on your iTunes right now and find biblical preaching that surpasses anything that you would have found in the 1700s, with the exception of maybe a Jonathan Edwards. But at the same time, there's a rootlessness that's involved in that too, where it's like, I love Jesus, but I don't go to church. Why? Well, I really can't find a home in any of the denominations. Or if I am a certain denomination, but the church isn't in my neighborhood, am I going to drive all the way out to where it is, or am I going to go to the other church in my neighborhood that's not denominational, but I can worship there? It's interesting. I'm not going to say it's good or it's bad. I'm just saying it's an interesting development where we are nowadays with this. But anyway, American Grace. If you want to go deeper into that, American Grace is the best source I can give you. So that gets me basically up to speed in terms of history and modern era. Now let me turn my attention to this. I want to get started with this. I will refrain from spoilers because the second half of the book, there's a lot of eventful things that happen. But just today, for this week, I want you to read the translator's preface, the prologue, and chapters 1 through 5. That takes you through chapter 99, or page 99 in this version. Shoshaku Endo, who is this guy? He's a Japanese Catholic. Okay, what does that mean? We'll find out. It's a story of 17th century Portuguese missionaries and their struggle in Japan. And you're going, why would I have you read this? There's several reasons. Silence allows us to talk about the Jesuits. Remember the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, a major product of the Catholic Reformation, Council of Trent. One of the main things that comes from this is the formation of the Society of the Jesuits. Read McGrath. I've given you page numbers to figure out where they are. But one of the things that were really important to the Jesuits, that it was this military mentality. This kind of sense of we need to go out and we need to be soldiers for Christ and we need to go to the far corners of the world and we need to tell everyone about this faith and we need to expand our numbers. So the Jesuits are a major force in this. Francis Xavier is a Jesuit. He's the first one in Japan. He lands in 1549. He's a major figure in this book because the characters that we meet in Silence, they're looking back at Xavier, and it wasn't that long after before they got there, and they're comparing their experience to his. So he's a significant character. So it allows us to talk about the Jesuits. Jesuits, I think I mentioned this already, but the Jesuits are significant for a number of reasons, not least of which our current Pope, Pope Francis, is a Jesuit, first one in a long time. And they're a very significant group within Catholicism. So we get to talk about the Jesuits, which is good. We also, more broadly, get to talk about missionaries. What's a missionary? A missionary is someone who travels with the express purpose of spreading Christianity. They are a major force. It's interesting because while Christianity post-Reformation is going through all this turmoil, is going through all of this ferment in Europe and also in America as well later on. While that's happening, at the same time, both Europe and America are sending missionaries to the far corners of the world to spread the gospel, to expand Christianity's range. And, like with so many other things we've talked about, there is scriptural precedent for this. There's the Great Commission. You probably know this verse if you spent any time in church circles. Matthew 28, 18 through 20. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I'm with you always to the end of the age." So you have these, these words are put in Jesus' mouth post-resurrection at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, saying, "All right, it's my show now. Go and make disciples of all nations." And the missionaries took this verse very seriously. And in some ways, missionaries they're an outworking of a serious, literal take on Christian theology. It's like, wow, if Jesus said what he said and meant what he said, and if Paul said what he said and meant what he said, then these people who have never heard the name of Jesus, who are living in some far-off country, are in dire need of someone to come tell them about Jesus. Someone to help initiate them into Christianity so that they might be saved, so that they might be spared hell, so that they might be spared separation from God. So in some ways, missionaries are people. It's too crass and it's unfair to say missionaries are the ones that take Christianity seriously. But there is an element of, look, if this is true, and these people have never heard, then we got a problem. And this is what inspires the missionary impulse. This is what inspires people to get, in that era, to get on boats and go to Japan and say, we are going to do this. We're going to spread the gospel. So, this missionary impulse. And this is obviously, even today, there are people that are going into dangerous places as Christian missionaries. Why? Because this is their motivation. This is what they believe. And they perform, historically missionaries have performed translation. They've performed, public service in the form of, like hospitals and clinics. And there's all sorts of things that have come from this. So there is that. And, and any discussion of Christianity has to take that impulse seriously. Because it's a direct outgrowth of theology. If my theology of heaven and hell says this, and here are these people, and they haven't heard, and this is where I believe they're headed as a result of that, I need to go tell them. So there is powerful theology going on here, but there's also a lot more going on here than just theology. Silence lets us talk about that. It lets us talk about the role that missionaries played in colonialism. If you don't know what colonialism is, you haven't been at UF very long, take a few more humanities classes, you'll find out. No, seriously though, colonialism is the struggle of East and West, and you see it in silence. And again, I'm not going to give away spoilers, but I'm struck by the way in which the Western people, the Portuguese missionaries, and the ones that send them into Japan, are convinced that there's a couple of things they believe. Number one, they believe that they are not just there by themselves. They're representing their nation, they're representing their God, and they're representing the entire Western world at the same time. And as a result, there's kind of this competition. Like, we will not lose to these infidels. Like, if there's a report that, early in the novel, there's a report that a mentor figure for the main characters had gone as a missionary into Japan, had renounced his faith there. And our main characters, they're incredulous. Like, that didn't happen. He did not lose to these infidels. And they don't use the word infidel, but it's kind of what they are. Because it's kind of a competition. We have the true faith, and we are we are coming from a good place. We're going into this dark land that doesn't know the truth, and we're going to give them the truth. There is it's under the radar, but there is still kind of a superiority complex at work there that says we know what you need more than you do. Because there's a repeated assertion in the novel that when things get hard, they say, well, things are hard, but if we don't do this, the church in Japan will die. We are the only people that are keeping the church in Japan alive. And they really earnestly believe this. Forgetting about the indigenous believers that have set up this leadership structure and are keeping the faith going, even though they haven't had any outside priests come in some time. So you have this colonialist bent with these missionaries. And you have the fact that missionaries are associated with trade routes, they're associated with military power. A lot of times missionaries are seen not just as, party neutral, I represent Jesus, I don't represent a lot of times that, the rulers of the nations where these missionaries would go wouldn't see it that way, would not believe them when they insisted that was the case, that you are an agent of Portugal dressed up in Jesus clothing. Obviously they wouldn't frame it that way, but I'm paraphrasing. You are connected with your home, you're connected with the empire that sent you, and we don't trust you. You think you're going to try to overthrow us or manipulate us or get us into a situation where you can take what's valuable from our land and export it back to yours. I don't think so. So you have these trade routes, you have this military, you have this territorial expansion that plays a role and builds mistrust as a result. But you also have it, again, in the missionaries themselves. You kind of have this little sense of, well, of course we're more enlightened than they are. We're coming to them to give them the truth, and we're coming to keep the flame of truth alive in Japan. And there is this kind of, we know what's better for them more so than they do, so let's go make sure that we save them. Which is kind of a hubristic thing to say. I mean, think about it. How would you feel if you were on the receiving end of that? Someone comes to your nation who's never been to your nation, can't speak your language in a lot of cases, but still insists that they know more about your world and what you need than you do. Probably wouldn't go over well. But this is exactly what's going on. So what you have then is you have these Portuguese missionaries. They want to go to Japan. They've been warned up and down how hard it is, what persecutions they'll face. But they want to go to Japan. And Japan is not, and the time of this novel takes place, Japan is not a friendly place for Christians. Why? Well, we've already talked about some of the reasons. Japan, at this point in the story, is acting very cruelly towards missionaries and also towards their own people who are Christians. They want to stamp out this Christianity. And you can see their perspective. I can't say, hey, it's a great idea to torture and kill people to make sure that they don't come and infiltrate your country, but I can kind of see where they're coming from. Because the Japanese rulers, they're looking at these missionaries coming in, and they're seeing them as a threat. And that's not without reason. Missionaries were often seen as kind of preparing the way for military conquest. Like, before we send our army in there, let's send in the missionaries to kind of see how the place is. And there was a suspicion, whether it was true or not, there was a suspicion that missionaries were kind of the first wave of the oncoming forces. So they were met with distrust, and they were met with suspicion just right off the bat. And the Japanese were not stupid, far from it. They were aware, in this case, they were aware of religious conflict in Europe, the Dutch versus the Portuguese. They also had Dutch traders who were trying, they weren't missionaries, but they were traders trying to get trade deals in Japan, and they were in the ear of their trading partners, the Japanese. They're going, these Portuguese, they're here, they say they're here for religious purposes, but they're really here to soften you up and to make sure that you sign better trading deals with them and squeeze us out. Don't let that happen. So there's all of these different things happening that are lining up against these missionaries. All of these different currents that are building, that are giving the Japanese rulers a lot of reason to look at these missionaries and go, I don't like what you're doing. And then these fears, these suspicions, this distrust seems to be confirmed because you have something called the Shimabara Rebellion, which happens in 1632. And this is historical. This actually happens. Which seems to confirm the worst fears of the Japanese leadership, because the Shimabara Rebellion is a Christian rebellion. It is Christians saying the way in which we're living is intolerable, we can't take this anymore, we're being persecuted, which was all true. Let's rise up and rebel. And so they did. The Japanese leaders put down the rebellion rather harshly, as you can imagine. But in the mindset of the Japanese leaders, see, these Christians can't be trusted. So in the midst of, in the aftermath of that, when a foreign power missionary, a Portuguese missionary, coming from a place that has territorial expansion in mind, says, hey, I want to come talk to you about Christianity, there's every reason for the Japanese ruler to say, I don't think so. So you have this adversarial situation. You have these missionaries going into Japan. Japan is not fond of them, not fond of the faith that they're bringing with them, and is going to try to stamp it out as best they can. And there's a lot of ways in which that plays itself out in the novel. This is not pleasant reading, some of it. It gets very dark in places. Now, it's not like, it's not graphic in the sense of, I need to not eat before I read it. But there are some really dark moments. So you have that happens. But meanwhile, so you have these power struggles. You have these people following this missionary impulse. And the novel, the missionaries in the novel, there's no reason to suspect they're acting with anything but the purest of motives. They really want to see Japanese people come to Christ. They're not, agents for Portuguese empires. But they are, even with the best of intentions, though, they run afoul of this Japanese government, because the Japanese government says Christianity, it's something that you outsiders are bringing in, it's a threat, it's not good for Japan, it's not needed in Japan, it's not wanted in Japan, so we're going to get rid of it. We're going to stamp it out as best we can. And caught in the middle of this is the Japanese Christians. People who have already taken on this quote-unquote outsider faith. What are they supposed to do? And they are caught in the middle. And this is the struggle of, in Endo's words, a borrowed religious tradition. How do these Japanese people take on this religion, and how does it work for them? And on the flip side of that, how does Christianity adjust and expand to meet the needs of Japanese culture? Christianity over the years has found itself to be extraordinarily adaptable to different cultures, but Christianity plays differently in different cultures. I mean, obviously the main points of theology are the same, but think about, if you have any experience with non-American Christianity, think about African Christianity as opposed to American Christianity. There's going to be profound differences. And Japanese Christianity, same thing. Different distinct cultures process Christianity in different ways. They highlight aspects, they downplay aspects. And a different culture will downplay those aspects and highlight those aspects. It plays differently, but history has shown that Christianity is adaptable. It is able to meet needs in these various contexts, but it doesn't do so in a cookie-cutter, same, one-size-fits-all, everyone gets the same exact version of Christianity. The religion changes, which makes things interesting. So you have this. So on one level, though, this is a story that's about these Japanese believers dealing with the fact that they're practicing a very un-Japanese religion. And how does that, think about your cultural identity. What does that mean? I mean, think about if you grew up in the Bible, if you're a kid from Birmingham, Alabama, and you grew up in the Bible Belt, and you converted to Islam. How would that work? Would there be people questioning your patriotism? I think so. Would there be people looking at you like, what are you doing? Probably. These Japanese Christians are in a very difficult position. And there's a quote here I want to read that kind of gets to this. This is a quote from the author. It's not in the novel. It's in the translator's preface, so it's not part of the novel. But it's the author himself writing in a different context. He says, "For a long time, I was attracted to a meaningless nihilism. When I finally came to realize the fearfulness of such a void, I was struck once again with the grandeur of the Catholic faith. The problem of the reconciliation of my Catholicism with my Japanese blood has taught me one thing. That is, that the Japanese must absorb Christianity without the support of a Christian tradition or history or legacy or sensibility. Even this attempt is the occasion of much resistance and anguish and pain. Still, it is impossible to counter by closing one's eyes to the difficulties. No doubt this is the peculiar cross that God has given to the Japanese." So, in other words, you can't just take fully formed European Christianity, pull it up, take some of it, put it over to Japan, stick it in the ground, and expect it to come out exactly like it did back in Europe. The Japanese folks are going to process it in a different way, and it's going to play very differently for them, and it's going to be hard because it's going against, it's going upstream, because the prevailing religion at the time in Japan was Buddhism, and the expectation was that anyone living at that place at that time, that's what they would be. So for these Christians living underground, practicing this underground religion, the challenges were extraordinary for a lot of different reasons. So you do have this adaptability in Christianity. You have the way in which Christianity can expand to meet these challenges, just not in the way in which the missionaries bringing it might have ever thought or suspected. And Endo is a great example of that, because he talks about what it means for a Catholic person to wear this non-Japanese, for a Japanese person to wear this non-Japanese religion. He calls it a borrowed suit in some cases, because it's, from a cultural perspective, it's really, really hard. So we get to talk about that. We get to talk about what that looks like. And then finally, we get to talk about suffering. We get to talk about silence. So many points along the way, the main character in this novel will basically look at the sky and go, "God, where are you?" And spoiler, I'm not going to give you a spoiler. Not yet. But he will, at several points along the way, go, "God, where's God in all this? How can God be present in all this? This is awful. Where are you? Where is the face of God?" And the face, pay attention to that, because the face of God is a common trope in this novel. It keeps circling back around to it. I picture the face of God like this. But at the heart of the novel, where it really starts to get real, he looks for the face of God, Rodriguez does, and he's not able to see him. He's constantly looking for reason in the suffering, looking for it to make sense, but he's having a hell of a time finding it. And so for Christianity, especially for us as Americans trying to understand this, this religion in 2016, understanding that we live in this age that's a little bit more given to emotionalism, that's a little more given to someone describing Christianity in terms of their personal emotional experience. When the personal emotional experience runs dry, then what? And what do? It's a real thing. And I remember Mother Teresa's memoir. I mean, you know who Mother Teresa is, I assume. But when her memoir was released a few years ago, it caused a real stir, because she was rather forthright about the fact that she wanted these kind of intense emotional experiences with God. She wanted God to supernaturally speak to her, and by and large, He wouldn't do it. She lived with profound silence, and a lot of Christians live with profound silence. I mean, you'll always have those followers of the religion who say, God spoke to me about what type of pizza I need to order. That does exist, and I don't want to discount that. I mean, or at least I don't want to discuss it now. But I want to just, as a historical phenomenon, I do want to note that a lot of people who practice this religion um, report that they don't have um, these really blow your mind emotional encounters with this Christian God. They just don't. Um, much more normal for them is this idea of silence, of quiet, of not being able to find God. I'm going to see if I can do it. There's a song by a Christian band named Jars of Clay. I think the song's also called Silence. I don't know if it's based on this book or not. Maybe it was. I'm going to see if I can put it on the website because it captures a lot of this. I think the chorus is basically, the singer going, "Where are you?" This is the normal for a lot of practitioners of this religion, which is rather interesting when you compare it to the people who, honestly, a lot of times the more public faces of Christianity that say, if you do X, Y, Z, then your life will transform in significant, magnificent ways. That's not a universal story. That's not even the primary story for a lot of people. A lot of people, the primary story is God is, I believe God is there, but I can't sense him. But as we'll go on to see in the second half of the book, a lot of the loose ends get wrapped up. I'll say that, and I'll have a lot more to say on silence next week in the lecture. So, what I'm really hoping to do now is just kind of set it up for you. So I'll have a lot more substantial things to talk about next week. But one thing before I go on this one, you might be wondering, or if you get into the book, you might be wondering, how the hell do I write exam questions on it? Focus on themes. Like, go back in this lecture note. I've given you 6 themes. Focus on those. Don't be tricky. I don't want obscure plot points. Like, I've given you an example here on the notes of the types of questions I don't want versus the types of questions I do want. Don't ask me where the name of the town where a character's from. I don't care. Focus on the main themes that I'm asking you to pay attention to, and try to draw those out in your question. Does that make sense? So, anyway, that'll get you started. Read the first half. Make sure to read the translator's preface because it's really helpful. And then we'll come back with a lot more to say next week.